Moving on to the material form of Beowulf, which is a manuscript. Before we talk about the specific manuscript of Beowulf, I want to talk about what manuscripts are generally. It might be something that you're not as familiar with. So basically, a manuscript is a book before the existence of the printing press. We are so used to books looking like this, having printed words from the printing press. Well, people had books before the printing press. They were just written by scribes and individually created. They just took a lot longer to make. So these are what books looked like before the arrival of the printing press. And each manuscript is individually copied by a professional scribe. This was the professional job of someone, to write books, to take one book, to copy it to another, and to copy it to another. That's how a manuscript is made. Manuscripts often also have many texts in one. They're more like anthologies than like a single book that has like a single tale in it. So Beowulf is actually in a manuscript that has many other narratives in it as well. Usually they're concerned with monsters. So we see Beowulf and its surrounding narratives as having a kind of theme of being about monsters. And the materials of a manuscript are also incredibly expensive. Another difference between like a modern book and a manuscript is that they were rarely written on paper as we know it today. In fact, they used something much more kind of hardy and long-lasting, which is the skin of a young animal. When you're looking at a manuscript, you're looking at animal skin that has been stretched and dried to make a writing surface out of it. That's usually referred to as vellum. So manuscript pages are made out of vellum, and they last an incredibly long time, which is why so many manuscripts from the Middle Ages still exist today. And as you can imagine, creating the writing surface out of animal skin and then producing each book one by one is incredibly time consuming. So manuscripts were very expensive. They were usually owned by wealthy, by the elite, and they weren't affordable for the lower classes. The manuscript of Beowulf has specific features that can tell us a little bit more about how the tale was read, other characteristics of the tale, and we'll be doing this in every week of the course. We'll be approaching the manuscript like archaeologists and anthropologists, thinking, what can this material object tell us about the narrative? These are really important artifacts that tell us a lot about the history, the reception, the understanding of a narrative. So we'll always be foregrounding that material object as we move forward in this course. So as you look at this image of the manuscript of Beowulf, you might notice that it looks like we have basically a piece of manuscript glued on to something else, glued onto a piece of paper, in fact. And that's true. Someone has taken the original manuscript of Beowulf out of its original manuscript form, and they have pasted each page onto a new piece of paper. Why did they do that? We can't be totally sure, but we know that based on the kind of burned edges of this manuscript that it survived a fire. In fact, there was a famous, terrible fire in the 18th century of someone's very valuable manuscript collection, which included Beowulf, that damaged the manuscript. So we're seeing a manuscript damaged by fire that a later archivist took apart and glued onto pieces of paper to kind of preserve it for later readers. We might also notice that this manuscript is pretty plain. If we look back at this example of a manuscript, it's very colorful. There are images and illustrations. There's ornamentation around the text. There's a lot of time and care taken to make it a beautiful ornamental object. Here, it's just, one color. It's just the text. There's really no ornamentation or illustrations that make it look fancy. That's a really important clue. And what scholars think that means is that this was not a copy of Beowulf designed to be read. It's not designed to be a beautiful object that someone would take home and read in their library or, in their reading room. Instead, it's likely that this was like a script that an oral performer would memorize and then perform for an audience. And that's, of course, very close to the original circumstances of Beowulf itself, which was an oral narrative told in person to one another. And this was usually done by a shop. See this four-letter word, S-C-O-P? That was like a courtly storyteller who would show up to, elite gatherings of rulers, of wealthy people, and tell a story. So we can see even in the manuscript form that Beowulf seems to be more of an oral narrative than what we traditionally associate with written narratives. It was meant to be told aloud. It was meant to be performed. All right, we'll be pausing there before moving on to themes.